Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you on behalf of the Kurtyka Foundation, represented by me. I'm Łukasz Płoski, and I have the pleasure of moderating today's meeting. Today's meeting, which is a part of our range of meetings with authors of books that were awarded with the Janusz Kurtyka Award. Today, there are two authors awarded. We have Professor Andrzej Nowak, who received the award for the Forgotten Appeasement of 1920. Professor, we are very happy that you are with us. And maybe in the introduction, a very brief one, I shall mention that Professor is a Sovietologist, a historian specializing in the 19th and 20th century Polish general history, as well as Polish-Russian relations. He's an author of 30 books and 200 articles. He was a winner of many competitions. And for us, a very special award is the award of Janusz Kurtyka. The second person whom we have with us today is Przemysław Benken, also a laureate of our award. He got this award for the book titled The Mysterious Death of Jan Eneld-Rodowicz. He's a Polish historian, a political science specialist. He graduated from the University of Szczecin, and he also cooperates with the Szczecin branch of the National Institute of Remembrance. He's a specialist of the 19th and 20th century. However, he looks at history from a bit more military angle. He's a historian of military history, and he also analyzes the history of the security service. He enriched the literature with several very interesting books. Dr. Przemysław Benken is also a laureate in the Janusz Kurtyka competition. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are very happy that we have this outstanding authors with us. Well, today's meeting won't be possible without the presence and acceptance of the cooperation proposal by Professor Mieczysław Biskupski. We would like to welcome Professor cordially. Well, to say a couple of words about Professor Biskupski, I would like to say that he's a graduate of the California University in Los Angeles. He's an American historian of Polish origin, and now he's associated with the Polish American Studies in the Central Connecticut State University. And Professor Mieczysław Biskupski is also an author of many books and a person awarded with the Cross of Merit of the Republic of Poland. Ladies and gentlemen, today books that we will talk about, that we will analyze today, have a certain element in common. During this meeting, we would like to highlight it. Well, both books, apart from the fact that they mention a wide range of different plots, they focus on the subject of the 20th century totalitarianisms. The book of Professor Nowak focuses on Bolsheviks. Professor Benken's book focuses on the world of oppression of the German Nazi and Soviet Russian regimes. So it's very important to stress that the date of our meeting, 25th of May, is a very special, sad day for Poland. Today, we think about the death of Witold Pilecki, who was killed by Polish communists. And in fact, he was fighting against two totalitarianisms, the German and Russian one. Ladies and gentlemen, so allow me to say a couple of words about Pilecki as a symbolic patron of today's meeting. In this way, we will commemorate this person as a great hero, an outstanding Pole. We know him from history books, but I also would like to remember in our daily life. I think that as for all the necessary introductory words, we have already made them. And I guess it would be good to say something about the project itself, the project that makes us meet today. I will ask Dr. Daniel Panevsky to make this introduction. I would also ask Doctor to mention a couple of words our organization as the initiator of this undertaking. Thank you. Łukasz, thank you for giving me the floor. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome everyone on. I would like to welcome professors, doctor, and also I would like to cordially welcome all our viewers. We are so very happy that we have managed to organize yet another meeting in the flagship project of the Janusz Kurtyka Foundation in Warsaw, which is the Janusz Kurtyka Award. I would like to thank Professor Biskupski for continuation of his cooperation with us. I would like to thank for making it possible to invite Central Connecticut University members to participate our project. Well, the Janusz Kortyka Award is the main project of our organization. Every year, the foundation grants the award to outstanding authors, extraordinary works focusing on the modern history of Poland. The subject matter of each book corresponds to specific editions of the competition in each year. So far, we have granted several awards starting from 2017 among our laureates. There are such as Tadeusz Wolfan, Tadeusz Falba, Damian Markowski, Andrzej Nowak, Przemysław Benken, Sławomir Dębski. Soon, already in summer this year, we'll learn who'll be a laureate of the next edition of our competition, and the award in the competition is the initiation of the translation of the awarded book into English and German if the foundation as an NGO manages to obtain the required resources. In this area, we are starting cooperation with recognized academic publishing houses in the West. So far, we published books of our award winners in Carolina Academic Press, Lang, Routledge, and we also initiated cooperation with the Gruiter Publishing House. So we are trying hard for the list of institutions that cooperate with us is as long as possible. The second element that I should mention in the context of the award is the organization of meetings during which the works of the awarded authors promote their books. These meetings are organized both stationary. Last week, Professor Andrzej Nowak had an opportunity to visit London, and there he had a lecture that referred to the subject matter of the book awarded by the foundation. But we also organize meetings in a hybrid form, a remote form, to be able to disseminate the knowledge and shared information with think tanks, intellectual centers in selected Western countries with special stress on English and German speaking countries based on solid scientific academic methods. We want to popularize Polish narration and achievement of Polish historians, which, as we know, with respect to standards, has never deviated from the historiography level of the West. Well, the only obstacle for Polish historians in the past and also now, we all scientists know about it, is the ability to communicate with international audience through publications in languages. It's one of the challenges which we are still facing in Poland. So it's one more reason to be really happy about another meeting in the project. Once again, I would like to thank you for accepting our invitation, and all of you, I would like to wish good intellectual results of the meeting. Our great authors will definitely not disappoint you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for this brief story about our project that made us meet today. Ladies and gentlemen, to add to what has been said, to add certain plots that must be mentioned here, I need to mention that today's meeting and translations of books are a part of the project on the popularization of the best scholarly works, and the project is financed from the funds allocated from the budget of the Republic of Poland for the Ability of Scholarship Program run by the Ministry of Education and Science, project number 513955. And now I would like to give the floor to Professor Biskupski, who will open the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to speak in English because I have to. My remarks today, I've titled Poland and the Second 30 Years' War. Let me begin this way. The complex slaughter, I'm sure as many of you know, of 1618, 1648, the so-called 30 Years' War, wrought major changes in the continent, inflicted massive casualties. Some areas saw population decline of over 50% and changed borders. In 1914, another long and destructive war, about 30 years, engulfed Europe until 1945 and caused, again, massive casualties and resulted in continental restructuring. Hence, the second era is likened to the first in terms of magnitude and lasting consequences. In the first era, religious division led to geopolitical realignment. In the second, the dominant cause was strategic. Both Germany and Russia wanted to dominate the continent, though political differences were also important as well. Just as Central Europe was the chief victim of the 17th century war, Poland was the chief victim in the 20th century. Poland had been faced with a fundamental geopolitical dilemma for centuries. It resulted in Poland's destruction, the partitions, and the inability to undo them for a century and a quarter. And indeed, it remains a problem for Poles today. This explains the Russian War in 1919-1920 and the German-Russian conflict barely 2 decades later. The traditional geopolitical architecture of Europe was, in my estimation, columnar. Western Europe dominated by France, though in frequent dispute with England. West Central Europe, the Germans. East Central Europe, often Poland, and the East, Russia. The partitions collapsed the Polish geopolitical role and thus inevitably brought Russia and Germany into conflict to determine restructuring. By 1914, France had been in decline since Waterloo, and the British found the continent a distraction from their empire. Germany viewed Russia as an inevitable opponent for continental dominance. The First World War was really a problem for Central Europe more than anything else, where the geopolitical future would be determined. This made Poland, long gone, an ironic focus. Simply as Józef Piłsudski foresaw before the war, and Piłsudski was always right, a German-Russian clash was inevitable and Russia would lose. But Germany's victory would be temporary. Its brevity was explained by Western resilience reliant on American material support. Thus, by 1918, Russia and Germany were both defeated, though Germany's damage is overemphasized in my estimation. France was in ruins, the British deserted the continent, and the Americans proved geopolitically rather immature. Wilsonianism, epitomized by the oversold League of Nations notion. As a result, there would be, after a brief pause, a second chapter, repeating the Russo-German conflict that had just ended. The 1919 peace solved little and left a continent both fragile and without direction. World War II was necessary, caused by the failure to conclude World War I sensibly. Poland was able to reemerge in 1918 due to circumstances beyond its control, but the question was immediately posed whether this reappearance would reconstruct the pre-partition architecture. If it did not, geopolitical conflict would simply continue with a second chapter in German-Russian rivalry. Poland would be a weak battlefield in that contest. Thus, November 11th saw Poland return to precious independence, but brought no security unless larger geopolitical changes could have been wrought. Poland was confronted with, and I quote Pilsudski, doomed to greatness, lament. Greatness, I should remark, here means geopolitical security, not imperial grandeur. The Poles understood this, the West did not. Poland needed either vast borders, perhaps a federal relationship, a close alliance system with the region, or perhaps some version of the two. Hence, 1918 was a great victory, but was only the first step towards freedom, not its achievement. That would require Russia to again be the East and expelled from the center. Only having accomplished that would the Poles be able to face the Germans. Poland must have safety in the East to be secure in the West. Anything less meant inevitable destruction. The West obviously never understood this, did nothing to promote it, and rarely worked to preserve it. Anglo-Saxon geopolitical parochialism. Hence, the Polish-Russian War of 1919-1920 was fundamental for Poland, but also for Europe. If Poland won, the architectural interrelationship between East and West Central Europe would be addressed, possibly solved, and the threat from the East reduced to the pre-partition magnitude. If Poland failed, Europe would fail. This problem was not subject to geopolitical compromise. Russia must lose and be driven eastwards. The borderlands must be freed and thus able to ally with Poland, or at least exist without a threat. Even a Polish victory was not enough. It would not free Ukraine and the Baltics and adjacent territories, and a failure here would doom Poland and more than Poland. A dreadful accompanying factor, now the home of communism, Russia must be defeated to rid the continent from civilizational disaster. Poland was a double barrier, a protection from historic Russian aggression and the isolation of communism. Hence, Poland's war with Russia was the pathway to the reconstruction of a functional East of Europe, thus of Europe itself. The enormity of this remains underappreciated, especially in the West. Poland, of course, won in 1920. The West deserves no credit for that at all. Indeed, one is tempted to say that indifference is a more suitable term, but victory is a usually misunderstood term. If you dominate the battlefield and drive your opponent into retreat, it is not victory unless the consequences for you in context are positive for your future. Hence, Warsaw in 1920 was a Polish victory, but it did not save the country's future, and hence it suggested a historic failure. Pilsudski's ironically dismal reaction after Russia's defeat, his emotional apology to his Ukrainian allies, are eloquent demonstrations of this. After all, he told us that, again, I'm quoting Marshal Pilsudski, without a free Ukraine, there cannot be a free Poland. Has contemporary echoes, I think you would agree. A perfect example of tactical victory not causing strategic victory. I hope en passant that the West has finally come to understand this in 2023. Thus, the irony: Poland won, but not enough. And Russia's defeat was not crushing enough to protect the east of Europe. Hence, a new Russo-German war was inevitable. Europe had failed because it did not understand its own eastern reaches. Geopolitical politics is hard to understand if you overlook basic elements. The failure of sufficient victory made the decades before the Second World War simply dreadful, as the West ignored the East until it realized that its self-absorption would be disastrous. But it was too late by then, much too late. The April 1939 British guarantees to Poland, for example, should have been made many years earlier. Western Europe failed, but Poland would have to pay. Thus, the 1939 German War is comprehensible only if historically contextualized. Opposing the evil of Hitler in Germany, German Nazism, suggests crusade, but was a geopolitical struggle reanimated and redrafted. If morality were really the West's stated causation of the war against Germany, why did the horrors of Russian imperialism not bring condemnation as well? The usual explanation was that Russian evil, to steal Mr. Novak's characterization from one of his recent volumes, was to be ignored because Russia was necessary to defeat Germany. So the moral crusade, as it's often presented in both England and the United States, is explained by geopolitical practicality. Also, a Russian victory offered no direct, or at least immediate, threat to the West, whereas a German victory would have. In fine, the West needed mercenaries, and the Russians provided them. Paying mercenaries is always demanding, but Churchill and Roosevelt solved this by turning Poland, and really the west of Eastern Europe, into functional currency. The associated argument by the West was that only the threat of a Third World War would restrain Moscow, so therefore, why do anything? Thus, tearfully, Poland was abandoned to prevent a world conflagration. No Western efforts to restrain the aggression of Russia against the east of Europe was done. During the Second World War, it is impossible to find efforts by either England or the United States to prevent Russia's mistreatment of Poland. When did Roosevelt plead for Polish security? Perhaps we should ask Roosevelt's apologist. Tehran and Yalta tell us enough. So 1945 brought the Second 30 Years' War to a conclusion. We are in 1648. However, just as Europe and America did not wish to accept the argument that the peace structure following World War I was not a solution, neither was its later version, 1945. Indeed, it was the appearance of an enormously enlarged Russian Empire, the disappearance of Eastern Europe, and the creation in Moscow of a quasi-religious passion, communism, which combined Russia's long conviction that it had an historic right to power with the more recently adopted conviction that communism was the basis of a crusade against the evils of capitalism and democracy. However, the delusion that 1945 meant victory was immediately in question. Only a geopolitical answer could solve the problem. NATO was a practical military alliance, and its funding was a far improved version of the powerless League of Nations. Germany, or at least its western part, was immediately joined with the very powers that had defeated it shortly before. But Eastern Europe was not significant geopolitically and had not been for generations as far as the West was concerned. This made Russia a greater menace as control of the East advanced its political advantage. It also enforced the Russian conviction of the right of domination. The ruined architecture of historic Europe could only be repaired if East Central Europe could reappear. The symbol of this is, of course, Poland. As Poland gradually disappeared from the consciousness of the West in the 18th century, it became geopolitically meaningless. What was the help to Poland during the 1919-1920 war with Russia, or during the Second World War in a larger context? Geopolitics is practicality, though it's tarted up claims of morality in both 1919 and 1945. Hence, naive people, such as I, stare into the portrait of Pilsudski, and I have his portrait over my desk, so I stare into his face every day, and wonder whether Ukrainian victory is now possible and whether Poland has now risen to a position in Europe where it matters. As noted, he once commented that there cannot be a free Poland without a free Ukraine, as I mentioned. This is a concise geopolitical conclusion, not sentimentality. Poland was the right cause in 1919 and in 1939, but was not thought to be of geopolitical value. Indeed, Poland was shabbily treated in both wars. Now, things are perhaps changing. A senior American general said just 2 weeks ago that Poland is not an American ally in Europe, it is the American ally in Europe. A British columnist last week invoked a more romantic version, and I'm quoting him, "There is now a shining light in Europe. It is red and white." The West can now, with the cooperation of Poland, finally end the Second 30 Years' War. We now have the question, but the answer is only in the foggy distance. Thank you.
Bardzo dziękujemy, panie profesorze, za pana referat. Teraz prosimy
Thank you so much for your speech. And now over to Mr. Nowak. Professor Nowak, over to you. Thank you. I'd like to speak Polish, since I can see that the majority of us are Polish speakers. And let me thank the Kurtyka Fund for invitation, and Routledge published my book. And I'd like to thank Professor Biskupski for his speech and for agreeing to be a speaker today during our meeting. Let me say a few words about what Professor Biskupski mentioned in his lecture. So those in the Kremlin, whether it is the communist Kremlin, like in 1920, 1939, and 1945, or anti-communist Kremlin. Let me remind you that Vladimir Putin says he does not support communist ideology. So whether ideology is communist or anti-communist in the Kremlin, from their point of view, from their perspective, control over Eastern Europe and Europe in general is based on arguments, on justification in propaganda and diplomacy.
These arguments are echoed in the West, in Western audiences. And here I'm thinking about public opinion influencers, and we may say opinion makers, as well as politicians. Well, the game that I try to demonstrate in my book that has been just published in English, titled The Forgotten Appeasement of 1920, Lloyd George, Lenin and Poland. Well, in fact, my book is an analysis of a kind of set of arguments that are still being used by Russia, Putin's Russia, not Stalin, Lenin's Russia anymore, Putin's Russia. So they are used against the same partners on the West. I think from this point of view, once again, you might analyze, well, for me, this is yet another analysis of the subject matter of the book, which is one of the two reasons of today's meeting. Well, obviously, apart from the book of Professor Benken. So we can look at this from the point of view of the repetition of certain arguments. So what arguments were used by Lenin and his Politburo colleagues, his colleagues from the Central Institution ruling Soviet Russia in 1919-1920 to justify their expansion in the eyes of the Western partners? This is, I would say, a matter that I try to analyze based on the documents in Russian archives, which in the 90s were still available to researchers in Yeltsin's times. Also, military archives were open to us. And afterwards, the reaction to these documents that took part in the West, you can analyze them based on the archival documents that I analyzed mainly in British and American archives. Lloyd George, Churchill's archives, and also under Secretary of State in the administration of Wilson and the Secretary of State Breckinridge Long, and the Secretary of State and other American high-ranking officials of the times. Well, obviously, it is just a very, very brief list of the sources that I used for my conclusions, my analysis. Well, the arguments that were used in the diplomatic game by Soviet Russia rulers against the West, these arguments can be divided into several groups. However, before I do it, well, I will not talk for a long time, I promise. However, what is needed is a short introduction. The Bolshevik Party, when they started ruling Russia, obviously they were motivated by the ideology of Marx and geopolitical factors. According to Marx's worldview, revolution was required, at least across Europe, and Russia was not a typical, I would say, a land for a revolution that Marx would think about. And such a land, without doubt, was Germany, with the biggest industry and the biggest working class. So in a situation when the revolution won in Russia, at least, well, you may say it was an operational success. They got Petrograd and Moscow. So then very natural direction, because of geopolitical reasons, ideological reasons, was the attempt to, as quickly as possible, have political, ideological impact Germany as well. So the way to Germany was the most important vector of strategic appetites of Russia. And now we have to explain in Western countries, in the perception of Western countries, Germany was the loser of the World War I. Well, nobody obviously undermined the meaning of Germany. In Paris, London, Washington, obviously, there were different opinions on how to treat Germany after them losing World War I. However, they were definitely treated as a very important factor for the future of Europe, whereas countries that appeared or reappeared on the map, like Poland, or for the first time, Czechoslovakia, or several Baltic republics, Latvia, Lithuania. Well, obviously, they did have their rich tradition in Middle Ages. However, they reappeared in the modern world for the very first time on the map. Well, it was a new thing indeed, but at the same time, a kind of a problem that required some kind of solution to ensure persistent order after a very bloody war. And the question was how to solve the problem, to treat the new countries as a kind of protection against potential German revisionism, or perhaps it should rather be treated as an element in negotiations, both with Germany and with Russia, in which the two superpowers, the loser, Germany, or the winners. I'm thinking about Russia. So very important superpowers could be obtained to accept the new order at the cost of the new and not terribly important at that time states. And well, the first version, I mean, based on these countries, together with Poland, relatively the biggest in the stripe of the new or re-emerging states in Central and Eastern Europe. So based on them against German revisionism was possible only for the country that was the most afraid of German revisionism, so by France. However, France, in line with the historical experience of the 19th century and above all, the very fresh experience from the First World War. So France believed that the only real counterbalance for German revisionism might be Russia and Russia only. Russia, that was such a precious alliance for France during the first stage of the First World War. And again, here we had a question mark appearing. Does it really make sense, even from the French point of view, to support new countries? It might be a lot better to win Russia, to rebuild cooperation with Russia, to prevent Germans for ruining the Versailles Order. However, what separated France from this choice in 1990 and 1920 was the fact that in the French politics at that time, other factors were important, and let's call them in a very general and not very precise way, conservative, definitely not pro-communist. And in Russia, the winning communist ideology, well, in France, it was hated by most of the French public opinion. And there were also some anxieties associated with the French capital invested prior to the First World War in Russia. Nationalization announced by Bolsheviks in a natural way triggered rather hostile reaction of hundreds of thousands of French stockholders of companies that lost their money in Russia. So in this situation, a kind of chance appeared for Poland and other countries of the region, like Czechoslovakia, just to be treated by France, at least, as a potential partner, or I would use the French term, which seems to be most to the point now, allié d'emplacement. So temporary alien. We cannot be with communist Russia ally. We cannot be in alliance with them. So let's take as a substitute Poland, Czechoslovakia, perhaps some other small countries in the region. Well, this kind of situation resulted in the fact that France in 1920 especially turned out to be a country relatively positive about Poland, and that's why the general diagnosis talking about a single policy of the West vis-a-vis the Bolshevik aggression in through Poland towards Germany, it was risky. Risky because without doubt the French political scene was very different. British political scene was different. British politics that were very important. Well, we have to say it openly because of the capital advantage. And we also have to, well, we are talking about the British financial advantage and inability of France to operate independently without Great Britain, to operate at big scale, offensive scale in Europe. So Great Britain had the last word in the context of European politics after 1990 for some time at least, because British politics was, I would say, set in such a way that it was believed we should rather be with Russia to have some stable peace in Europe. All right, there's this great game in Asia. However, in Europe, well, with the sound interests of Russia and with the sound interest of Germany, only if you envisage the two, you can ensure stability and economic reconstruction. David Lloyd George had this point of view, and I guess we can risk the general saying that most of the establishment, British establishment at that time, believed in it. And well, America should be put aside because America by itself stepped out from European politics because of not ratifying the Treaty of Versailles by Americans, the disease and the failure of the ambitious plans of the new political order in which the US would play a decisive role. So all these factors resulted in the US not playing a relevant, active role in the politics in 1920. I'm sorry about all the initial remarks that were really needed to briefly present now a kind of set of arguments that Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky, Kamenev used, the four members of the Politburo, so the political managing group. There were four members at that time in the group. Well, Lenin as the leader. So Politburo used the following tactics. On the one hand, the objective, real, declared during Politburo meetings, and also announced the propaganda, both the one that was directed at the Red Army and the one that was directed at workers' parties that were focused in the Third International established in Moscow 1919.
And they wanted to make Berlin red, crossing Poland. Across Poland, you can also establish the Soviet Republic in Poland, it doesn't matter, but you arrive in Berlin finally and instill the communist rule there. Obviously, Western countries understood the important role of Germany, and they didn't want to hand over Germany to Russia, not to mention communist Russia, because both Paris and London believed that they couldn't allow that to happen. There was another set of arguments, not addressing the army and the workers, but it was to attract the attention of leadership in the West. And these arguments were meant to conceal the actual objective, which was to rule around Europe at large, including Berlin, of course. So in order to convince the public opinion in the West, they presented different arguments. One form of argument was about the view, the vision, in line with the British public opinion and politicians in London and important leaders in the West as such, who believe that in order to restore order in Europe, only superpowers had to unite efforts because smaller countries are in the way of establishing and restoring peace and order. So you had to ally with countries, superpowers that might not be at the diplomatic table at the moment, but you have to ally with other European countries in order to restore peace and order in Europe. So realists in the US, Henry Kissinger, the ones whose centenary we are commemorating, and Joe Minsheimer is a contemporary representative of the approach. In those days, this was the argument put across by Soviet Russia. They said, don't you pay attention to Poland, turn a blind eye at them. We will not conquer other countries. We are only focusing on Poland. Poland is what we need, and we will reinstate our zone of influence, and Poland belongs to the Russian sphere of interest. Warsaw has to succumb, and it will be in our zone of influence. These days, we hear other arguments. Sometimes they're very similar to those in the past. For example, Ukraine is part of Russia. Ukraine belongs to us. The Russian leadership says we're not going to attack Poland, maybe, but we are not going to attack Germany. And none of the countries of the so-called old Europe, the US, the UK, France, Germany, they have to recognize that Russia has a right to restore its sphere of influence, and the West cannot put its feet on the territory of Ukraine. And if Ukraine wants to ally with Western countries, it means violation of the frontier that Russia has set. In 1920, Poland was in a similar situation. Russia cannot allow that Ukraine distorts the global order. Only superpowers can define the order. It's an opinion of Russia. Right, so as regards ideological approaches, it was about challenging and undermining the right to existence of some countries. Therefore, Bolsheviks in those days appealed to some of the representatives of public opinion in Western countries. Communists in France or the UK in 1920, there were not many of them. But when we speak about progress, there was some positive sentiment towards the leftist ideas. It was quite a widespread phenomenon, and it is even more dominant today, these days. The Bolsheviks took advantage of those tendencies, of those sentiments. We Bolsheviks, Russia, we represent advancement, progress. It is an experiment that is implemented using brutal tools. You might not like it in the West, but in the future it will improve the well-being of millions of people, Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, They represent reactionist ideals of their nations. It is about nationalism. Nationalisms are dangerous, and these smaller countries, if they want to draw a border which they perceive as safe, accuse communist Russia of imperialism. Soviet Russia and Great Britain under David Lloyd George as a prime minister, they have a fight between themselves, and they say that Poland is the most imperialist country in the world, although 34 square kilometers belong to the UK and more than 20 million square kilometers belong to Soviet Russia, and they pointed out Poland as an imperialist state, a dangerous imperialistic state. So smaller nations were accused of nationalism, of reactionism, of sticking to the past and being against advancement represented by Soviet Russia, who was ahead of other countries in their opinion. And there were other accusations of new nations, and public opinion in the West, in Western Europe, did not like some of the ideas. For example, anti-Catholic stereotype. Great Britain or some specific people in Great Britain who decided about policy, Philip Kerr, that I mentioned, maybe not a well-known person in diplomatic textbooks, but in 1920 he played a decisive role as a private secretary of David Lloyd George. He managed the correspondence to Prime Minister, and he made some suggestions. He was a former Catholic who left Catholicism, the religion of his forefathers. And some people who change their faith become those who criticize their former religion most viciously. Of course, it was not a rare example in those days, and France was divided, Catholic tradition of France versus those who were post-Dreyfus followers who wanted to create a secular state and fought any religion or faith. So Poland as a reactionist state, as it was perceived with old values, Jesuit and Pope were a symbol of that. This is, of course, a shortcut that I'm mentioning. But I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that in 1920 it was not existent yet, but now Putin is using this argument while attacking smaller nations. This is about fascism. Mussolini started his career in those days, but fascism was not yet known in those days. So nationalism plus these die-hard tendencies, reactionism, reactive approach, and if you use Nazism with it, as Putin addresses Ukraine, but Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Moldova, they also hear such notions in reference to them. Reference to anti-Semitism, which is raised today. These days, the situation looks totally different. compared to the Second World War, of course. But Putin is now mentioning Nazism in reference to Ukraine and Poland, for example. And of course, Putin wrote a publication in 2020 in the US. It was published actually, and it is an article full of accusations against Poland and Ukraine, which is mentioned as the second most important country in this context, that Polish politicians, Poland actually invented anti-Semitism, and this was one of the theses in the publication of Vladimir Putin. And Bolsheviks also presented Poland as a diehard, which is against the progress advancement that the Red Army is bringing to Poland. This was not annexation, it was emancipation, it was freeing Poland. This is how propaganda promulgated these ideas. And in 1920, some of the leftist politicians, including those in Great Britain, these sentiments became popular because some of the trade unionists in Great Britain actually supported ideas of Russia, that you do not have to support Poland, who was fighting for its capital, because Poland is a reactive country, and the Red Army brings freedom to workers and brings progress and brings emancipation. And of course, in 1920, there were such people running the country, and they were quite successful at some point. Someone who presents themselves as the defender against fascism, Nazism in Poland or Ukraine, which is presented as Bandera followers, the organization of nationalists in Ukraine, which is presented as a fascist Bandera following nation. So these days, public opinion in the West is honed in such a way so that it turns a blind eye at Eastern Europe, that it is not worthwhile to support, to assist people who suffer from nationalism, fascism, anti-Semitism, and maybe Putin is not an ideal with liberal and democratic values. Still, countries, nations he wants to subdue, they do not deserve support.
So in a realistic, inverted commas, realistic, but some supporters will call themselves realists. So they talk about the need to only mind the interest of big empires without focusing on the needs of smaller countries. And the other school, the, say, progressive school, referring to progress, well, today obviously strengthened by Putin, by referring to the Second World War. Russia as the country that rescued the world against Hitler. Well, this argument is being used to some extent effectively by Putin's propaganda. We rescued the world, and you want to support those that supported Hitler, thinking about Ukrainians. So this is what Putin says in his own text as well. So taken together, it constructs, a platform for comparisons of those arguments that are supposed to build the appeasement policy in the West. So appeasement, acceptance of the invasion seen as liberation, in fact, by Russia. Liberation, the liberator, big liberator, or a country that has every right to have safety in its own yard, to put it in a very colloquial language. I think it's good to look from this point of view at the book, in which I talk about the political game of the Soviet Russia in 1920, the game or the play against Great Britain and the US. And it's good to think about topicality of these arguments and attempts to counteract them. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor, for your presentation and the aspects that join the past with what you see today. And now I will ask Przemysław Węgiel to take the floor. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Today, I would like to say a couple of sentences about a group of young people who, during the first half of the 20th century, especially in the 40s, they were played with by two totalitarianisms, the Hitler's Germany and communism in the Stalin's form of it. I'm thinking about the veterans of the Home Army, Radosław group that took in summer 1944. These people already during the German occupation, prior to uprising, experienced terror in Warsaw, and for this reason they were involved in conspiration against German occupation, with the climax being the involvement in summer 1943 during the uprising. We know that these were very long, harsh and bloody fights that were really detrimental to them physically and mentally. Well, Germans compared these battles to Stalingrad and then Berlin defense. However, the prize ended, part of the veterans of the Radosław group wanted to continue the fight for independence. Well, obviously, it concerned those people that survived the Warsaw Uprising, that were not killed by Germans, that were not captured by Germans, or remained in the rubbles of Warsaw, in the Praga district, or remained in the city when the Polish-German fights were over. Already in November 1944, one of the commanders of the Zośka battalion, it was one of the battalions that was a part of the Radosław group. He met the commander of the group, Colonel Jan Ozorkiewicz, and Radosław was named after this person, and there is talked about establishing of a new secret organization that would continue the fight for independent Poland after its territory has been invaded by the Red Army. Because the second half of 1944, this is the time when the geopolitical situation is formed in such a way that in the territory of Poland, groups of the Russian army appear and the front moves through the territory of Poland, and certain formations of the Russian secret apparatus appear. This is they in plan to prepare the ground for the installation of Russian system. And there was a decision made to form a military group, the Kmita group, called after Colonel Kozlowski. So this group, this unit, was a mission to continue the activity that I have mentioned. And at that time, they only have a fraction of the potential that they used to have during anti-German conspiration, because as I have mentioned already, very few veterans of the Warsaw Uprising survived the fight and were at that time available to Kozlowski or Colonel Jan Mazurkiewicz. Nevertheless, it was a kind of manifestation, their willingness to fight for independence. And these people, they planned to use in their further activity the armament that was used during the Warsaw Uprising, that was not lost, not damaged, but hidden among others in the ruins of Warsaw for future use. And they also intended to acquire uniforms that would be taken away from Soviet soldiers or the Polish army soldiers, and moving in the territory, they should look like a small subunit of the Polish army, and in this way they would not be the activity will not be revealed. The group consists of two groups, and in general, in the composition in it, there are also people that got wounded during the Warsaw Uprising. So I would say that the real core for more advanced activities was Jan Anod Rodowicz, and I will talk about him in the next part of my presentation. And the objective for this group, as I've mentioned, was to run activity to prevent Soviet rule over Poland. However, their resources were so limited that they only had certain paper material distribution actions. They tried to stop and make a search of Russian army soldiers. They documents, weapons, and uniforms were taken away. They use financial resources that remained from anti-German conspiracy. Henry Kozlowski, after years, talked about the so-called second conspiration in the following words, I quote, "We had military vehicles, uniforms, and very good papers. So we had two passenger vehicles and a bike that we could use. And nevertheless, as I have mentioned already, there were attempts made to undertake more, say, advanced activity using the armament still held by them. However, at the end of the day, it never really took place. Even in the situation when there were certain plans associated with the protection of the commander of the No Association, Fieldorf, who was in Rembertov, who was Captain Rembertov in the camp there. So there was a plan to liberate him. However, it did not take place because before the attack on the camp, information was obtained that August Fieldorf was already deported to the east. And so these activities had a very limited character, and it's really hard to compare them to what happened during anti-German conspiration. And Once again, I have to say the resources were really limited. The resources that the veterans were able to use. Afterwards, on the 7th of May 1945, after the NIE organization was dissolved, I mentioned it at the very beginning of my presentation, Mazurkiewicz became the commander of a central unit of a new structure established in London at that time, the commander of the Polish army, General Anders, and the objective for the structure was to consolidate military underground structures, to inform London about the situation in Poland, protection of citizens, and conspiration against the national and Soviet security apparatus, propaganda, as well as anti-Soviet propaganda, cooperation with the London headquarters, transportation of money, people, documents, and also political resistance around Stanisław Mikołajczyk. So these tasks were also undertaken by the members of the Radosław group in the anti-Soviet activity. However, already on the 5th of August, Colonel Mazurkiewicz was arrested by the communist security apparatus, and in the consequence, there was an idea to liberate him by capturing kidnapping the dead ambassador of Russia in Poland and to exchange the two persons. And the action was planned by the members of the Kmita disposition group, above all the combat group that consisted of 10 people managed by Jan Rodowicz. Well, this action, this operation was well planned and executed. However, it was not successful because it was not possible to stop the vehicle in which the Soviet ambassador was traveling. And here a very short quote of Kozłowski that managed the operation, quote, "We prepared a trap for Lebediev, ambassador. He was, as always, in a uniform with a woman BMW managed by a military driver, and our obstacle vehicle was not effective. The driver did not stop. He slowed down, went around the vehicle and got on the track of a railway. We were not able to kidnap them, and we did not shoot them. We wanted to repeat the operation in future. The person in the uniform turned towards us, but didn't say a word, and we were all in uniforms, and we looked like a regular unit of the army. Well, obviously, Kmita soldiers were dressed like this to mask their activity. So it was the most, say, advanced operation that potentially can lead to the use of arms by the members of the group. However, as you can see, it was futile, and there were plans to repeat it, but already on the 21st of August 1945, Radosław was arrested by the communists. There was a decision to reveal to the communists, and there was an agreement that was supposed to guarantee to all veterans of the home army that would reveal themselves. There was an amnesty covering all the activities prior to the revealment.
There were other issues that are noteworthy. So representatives of the home army had certain achievements, of course. And let me mention a few words about individuals who were part of Kmita group, and they trusted Colonel Mazurkiewicz, and this intervention was planned but was unsuccessful. As regards armaments and uniforms, during fights against the Nazis, they did not hand it over to communists. Henryk Kozłowski and Jan Rodowicz actually concealed it and on the territory of Warsaw. It was hidden simply. Right, this action by veterans of the Home Army, they had to hand over their arms if they wanted to enjoy amnesty so that they are not involved in other armed actions afterwards. Veterans of the Home Army who cooperated with Henryk Kozłowski, taking into account the situation in the country, they decided that the best solution was to abandon conspiracy and try to live a different life in this situation, which does not mean that they supported communism. Still, they wanted to start everything from scratch, that maybe it was an intermediary period and maybe the communism will not triumph finally. And maybe these young people who went through hell during the Second World War, who wasted away their youth, that they could get employment or education, which was interrupted by the war, and also have some private life to start a family, for example. And Colonel Mazurkiewicz had an agreement with the communists about amnesty. And as regards the Home Army, when they revealed their activity against the communist authorities, not all of them enjoyed freedom. Of course, if there was another world conflict that could burst out, and these people would have fought against communism, that when they left conspiracy, something that could indicate that they had other objectives against communism. They had meetings, so-called winter meetings, let's say, to come around and discuss different opinions. Radosław battalion from the Home Army has a huge experience as regards anti-Nazi actions. They are good with conspiracy, with arms, and they can manage large groups that dealt with conspiracy. They had battlefield experience. Of course, they were perceived as a threat by the communist regime because they never identified with communist values. These were often children of former intelligentsia, intellectual elite in Poland in those days. So communists could not trust them, could not believe that they would become part of the efforts to build new communist reality. Of course, veterans of the Home Army, if they wanted to uncover, they would have to tell about their activities in conspiracy. And of course, they didn't want to cooperate in terms of building communist reality. And of course, the communist authorities started to recruit informers that had something to do with the home army, who knew people in the home army, so that they act as rats and pass on information about them to the secret services, to the apparatus, so that pressure could be exerted on them. 20 people were in Kmita group, but in this case, it was a larger group, and people who were former prisoners of war were returning to Poland from all over Europe. These were also women, people with disabilities who suffered injuries as a result of their battlefield experience. And they all posed a threat to the communist regime. So if there was a baptism-related event in a family, or someone was getting married, so these guests were infiltrated by informers. Speaking of Radosław, part of the home army, not all weapons were handed over. Some of them were hidden in the ruins of Warsaw. And finally, when the security apparatus started repressions against these people in 1948, 1949, during Christmas in 1948, Officer Jan Rodowicz was apprehended, detained as the first one, because he had a lot of information about his colleagues, including the whereabouts of hidden weapons, because communists knew that weapons were hidden somewhere but didn't know where. So they wanted to get information from Jan Rodowicz, obviously. And therefore, people who wanted to get amnesty and uncovered themselves became victims to security apparatus of the communist state. Some researchers say that this conspiracy was, let's say, a fake conspiracy under the communist regime. And communists did not only want to prosecute home army soldiers, but they wanted to use different arguments in order to carry out repression, to crack down on the so-called enemy, people who didn't share communist views. And the Ministry of Public Security disclosed some of the places where weapons were hidden, but they were not actually in a good state, and these pistols or rifles could no longer be used in order to carry out so-called terrorist attacks against the communist authorities who wanted to control the state. Communists had a different approach. They used it for propaganda. On the 5th of February in 1949, when the repressions were underway, the article was published. Let me quote: surveillance carried out by public security authorities indicate that some of the former home army soldiers from Zośka battalion and other battalions, other squads, want to organize terrorist groups, and they collect explosives and weapons. Dozens of members of this organized group were detained and arrested. And this group that was to carry out terrorist attacks was dismantled. Security services continue their actions in order to counteract terrorist activities. And so dozens of people from Radosław Home Army were detained, and people with disabilities who suffered injuries during the war were not a threat to the communist authorities. Jan Rodowicz, mentioned by me several times, on the 7th of January 49, not long after he was detained, died. We still don't know what was the real reason of his death, because there are no good knowledge about that. And my book, The Mysterious Death of Jan Anoda Rodowicz, inquires into the secret of his death. And well, of course, some other representatives of the Home Army received sentences of 25 years in imprisonment. Some received the decision about capital punishment, which then was turned into lifelong imprisonment. But if someone spent even a few years in a Stalinist prison, it was more than enough. In 1953, and no one could expect that Stalin would die, and it would lead to liberalization of the situation in the country. And then sentences were cut, and people were released in numerous numbers, but their personal and their career suffered, and so on and so forth. And after 1956, this situation was totally different compared to Stalinist era. Still surveillance was carried out, informers were still working, and even when someone was not strictly involved in work in the security apparatus, there were quite a number of informers that carried out surveillance and collected information. And the security apparatus knew a lot about former Home Army soldiers, combatants. So to wrap up my speech, I'd like to say that sadly, regrettably, some individuals who fought Nazism, if the Second World War ended with a different consequences, they would have been heroes during communism, but they couldn't even mention their heroic deeds because there was intimidation, prosecution, and only after 1989 they could be open about their activity.
The activity against Germans, against Russians in the so-called second conspiracy, the Home Army, when Germans were no longer present in Poland. Unfortunately, many people didn't live that long till 1989, so the lot was sad, and some of them, unfortunately, as the materials collected by the Institute of National Remembrance Archives show, because of different reasons, sometimes blackmail, they started cooperating with the communist security service. They provided information on their colleague, which facilitated the work of communists, facilitated oppression, and it also led to sometimes the suspects during interrogations learned that the security operators knew a lot of them, knew everything about them, so they got disoriented. They had psychological problems. They lost their faith, and communists used it to further develop, the chain of accusation of the following people. It was really painful that people that were real heroes during the fight against Germans were so terribly, terribly treated by communists later on. That would be it from me. Now, more information about the subject and more information about the investigation against Jan Rodowicz, ended with his death in circumstances still unknown, as well as the methods of the work of the security service, the work with informants. You can find all these information in my publication that I have mentioned here several times. Thank you very much, Doctor. I just wanted to mention that the publication will be made by Peter Lang in 2023 in our website. Will inform you when the book is published. And now we would smoothly go to the discussion. Well, because we have very limited time by Professor Nowak, I would suggest that the first question can be asked to Professor Nowak so that we could get the answer from Professor Nowak response. So I'm giving the floor to Professor Biskupski.
Thank you. Professor Nowak, a brief question. Let's assume that World War I has just ended. What could the Western powers have done to result in a more secure and stable Europe?
Jeśli można, odpowiem po polsku.
Well, if I may, I'll answer in Polish. Well, the answer can be found in the book published in 1990 as a kind of guidebook for the rulers of the winning superpowers. It was called Democratic Ideas and Reality. And the book was penned by the author of Anglo-Saxon Geopolitics. This book, I would like to remind you, tried to attract attention, unfortunately without effect, tried to attract attention to the key meaning of what was called middle tier that separated Germany from Russia. The author, at the same time, you may say he was the member of the British Parliament, Halford Mackinder, great geographer. Yes, so the author of Anglo-Saxon Geopolitics today, he's definitely a classic author in the area. So the author attracted the attention to the fact that if the Anglo-Saxon superpowers, because they were the main audience, don't invest financially, strategically, militarily in strengthening the middle tier, so the land from Finland, Estonia, Latvia, he put these two countries into one, but it doesn't really matter. Lithuania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, all the way to Bulgaria and Greece. So without this, without doubt, Russia will come closer to Germany, and the Treaty of Versailles will be ruined. So this geopolitical look associated with the attempt to defend certain values that are not making the red in the liberal democratic system represented by Great Britain, the US and France as well, obviously. So it required from him to highlight, if we want to rescue the system, in Great Britain and stability in Europe, we have to invest our resources. We have to invest militarily as well to strengthen the mid-tier. Harold Mackinder personally tried to be involved in the process, and he assumed the role of an agent, a middleman between Józef Piłsudski and Anton Denikin at the beginning, well, at the end of 1919. And he was trying to start a cooperation between somebody who was fighting for Russia free of Bolsheviks and the main power in middle tier, Poland. Unfortunately, as we know, Denikin was not willing to cooperate with Poland in any other way, only in terms of the rebirth of Imperial Russia. All the mission of Mackinder and all his ideas were undermined by Lloyd George, Prime Minister, during the sitting of the British government in January 1920. So, well, unfortunately, yet another time we see that a book cannot convince anybody. Even the best book with the best arguments written by the best author, such a book cannot effectively change reality. People only learn on their errors. So the policy of appeasement, the policy of concessions at the cost of weaker countries, the aggressor, Russia, Germany in 1938, Hitler's Germany. At the end, I hope that in 2022, some people, a big part of the Western political scene, learned that appeasement policy does not pay off, that you should rather strengthen the weaker countries so they don't become a victim. And this is how I would answer to the great question of Professor. You have to strengthen weaker countries that are at the risk of of stronger countries, not to provoke other aggressive steps of the strong ones that then really ruin the order of the world. We have to stop them from the temptation of satisfying the imperial appetite. We have to start with the weaker countries, but we never stop there. We go forward. And, well, the lesson has been learned. In 1938 with Hitler, as we remember, he did not keep, within several months, he did not keep any of the declared objectives of limited expansion vis-a-vis Czechoslovakia. Stalin, 45 or 43, 45, and also respect to Putin in 2008 after aggression in Georgia and 2014 aggression in Ukraine, when appeasement won. At that time, appeasement won. And I hope that in 2022 something really changed, but this is only my wishful thinking.
Thank you very much.
I jednocześnie bardzo przepraszam.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm sorry. Unfortunately, I have some other duties, so now I have to thank for the invitation to this meeting, and I hope in future we'll have an opportunity for a longer discussion. I would like to thank the organizer, the professor, and all the participants of the debate. Thank you, and see you soon. Thank you, Professor. On behalf of the Foundation, and we are coming back to the discussion. Professor Biskupski, the floor is yours again.
Thank you very much. Professor Benkin, let me ask perhaps a peculiar question. Looking back on what the communist authorities did to the heroic veterans of the underground, do you think what they did was in the long range to the benefit of communism in Europe, or was it damaging to the interests of the communists in Poland, I should have said?
No cóż, komuniści niewątpliwie działali
Well, communists without doubt operated at many stages, and initially they presented many catchy slogans, and they also revealed right from the very beginning. They didn't reveal the full spectrum of their political program. It was prepared not only for the Polish society, but also for other countries which after the Second World War were under the influence in Central and Eastern Europe. And here, worth mentioning is the issue of, in the context of Poland, Polish villages promotion of the so-called agro reform that was a serious problem for the Polish rural areas. Before 1939, communists, when they assumed power in Poland, they declared they would solve the problem, and peasants finally will get ownership of land. So in the area of the so-called previous Poland, old Poland, the one that remained from the Republic of Poland, and they would also obtain land in the so-called regained land. The name of them should ring the bell, the Western land, although that will be added to Poland at the cost of Third Reich. And these postulations had certain value as for the Polish rural areas. However, these activities, on the other hand, were limited by the fact that the lack of trust vis-à-vis communists and the Soviet Union was really high at that time in Poland. People could remember 1920. They remembered what the Red Army did, how they behaved, how communist officials behaved in the areas that they managed to get to in 1920 before they were pushed out by the Polish army and Józef Piłsudski. And then throughout the 20 years between the wars, there was very intensive propaganda of the Polish government presenting to the Polish population everything that happened in the East. The hunger in Ukraine because of collectivization introduced by Stalin, the Second World War, and again, Soviets in Poland after 17th of September 1939 and the relatively short period of the first Soviet occupation demonstrated to many Poles that the Soviet model was inefficient and not good, and it just confirmed all the stereotypes that the people knew from 1920 and the propaganda of the Second Polish Republic. Yes, the level of life in the Soviet Russia was lower, central economy was not effective at all, and kolkhoz did not produce anything good, and the fight against ownership taking land away from peasants not only increases production, but just the opposite, decreases it. The system was not efficient, and several waves of deportation of Poles from the land that was captured by Russian after 17th of September 1939 and deportation deep into Russia's territory. It absolutely shared the doubts vis-a-vis the communist system. People came to Siberia and lagers for many of those people that were not occupied by Germans. Prior to 1941, many of these people believed that the communist regime was even worse than German occupation.
So it was extremely difficult to actually lure towards the communism in Poland. And of course, I am not speaking about the worst manifestations of communism. First, pre-war officers were included in the Polish army. The first attaché in London was the former officer in the Polish army. Authorities did not speak about collectivization. They were actually saying that people are going to own plots of land, that they could participate in elections, and after the warfare, it was decided that so-called free elections are going to be organized in Poland. Communists obviously understood that there was no massive support for the regime. It was not entrenched, not rooted in Polish society, unlike in some countries in Asia, for example. So they were convinced that on the one hand side, the Red Army was used. On the other hand, the security apparatus was gradually enlarged, and surveillance was carried out against enemies of communism. So these were gradual efforts to fight so-called enemies of the people. And Radosław, part of the Home Army that I mentioned in my speech in 1945 in autumn, they started to trust the communist authorities. Therefore, they uncovered themselves. They counted on amnesty, which was in operation before 1948 or 1949 in some cases. And these people were detained again, arrested, interrogated. And conspiracy still existed to a certain extent. And this is the group of people that we commemorate right now. And these were excommunicated warriors. We couldn't speak about them during the communist days. And of course, the security apparatus lacked staff because people did not want to collaborate with them. And there were only few who actually got involved in building communist state in Poland. And we now commemorate activities of the so-called cursed soldiers or doomed soldiers who were operating in those days. So time played a huge role. So we may say that it was as if boiling the frog, let's say. So in the beginning, people were not afraid of the communist system. They didn't expect it would be sometimes worse than the war, because people could attend churches in the beginning when communism was introduced, and people had some feeling of security in the beginning, and gradually surveillance resulted in destroying conspiracy groups. So it was important how people were perceived by the regime, not actually who these people really were, what were their plans, and so on. For example, when I studied biographies of Home Army combatants, when they mentioned their stay in Warsaw in 1944-1945, they were suspected of participating in the Warsaw Uprising and maybe being a Home Army soldier. So they became suspects. It is a very important question, Professor Biskupski, and it is a topic for a lengthy discussion, actually. So this is my point of view based on literature of the subject and my own research. I hope I answered your question at least partially.
Yes, you did indeed. Would you, I'm asking our Chairman, would you like me to pose a second question or should I not?
Myślę, panie profesorze, że możemy sobie pozwolić na jeszcze jedno ostatnie pytanie.
We can answer the last question now, not us, of course, but the person you will address the question. Last question, please.
Yes, I'll have to make this rather short because my own material is running out of power. So forgive me if I ask a short question. And that is this. If we look at Poland and the persecution of the war heroes of Poland by the communists, can we compare this in any way with the other satellite states created after 1945? Is there one that's similar, or are there others that are radically different?
Cóż, tak jak już tutaj wspomniałem,
Right. So the approach was diversified depending on political affiliation of the underground and resistance movement. The most important enemies were those related to the national groups that were called nationalists. So persecution was the most strict, harsh in their case. And those who were believed to have some arms, they could have actually participate in resistance and inflate it. Partially, I mentioned collectivization and establishing collective farms. In the beginning, this initiative was not publicly announced, and representatives of rural communities were against collective farms. In the beginning, they had some plot of land, but actually the idea behind that was that this plot of land would not be enough for their subsistence, and they wanted to combine these small farms and create huge collective farms, but people were against it, and they preferred not to have enough produce but not become representatives of collective farms. After the war, at least immediately after the war, the international situation was not actually stable. And as regards other conflicts, there was no certainty that there would be no other huge armed conflict. And well, anti-communist activity was still continued. They could renew their activity. So they have become civilians, they had families, they continued education, but they have certain experience, and the regime didn't trust them if they were part of the Home Army. Neither in 1956 nor later, this prosecution never actually ended. Security apparatus still followed them in a milder way later on, but still. And then Solidarity was born in Poland, and many former Home Army combatants were involved in that. One of them was the head of the Solidarity Committee in his enterprise, and for the first time then he told about his experience in the Home Army, and he became the chairperson of the Solidarity group in this particular location. So they were always perceived as dangerous, and there was a prosecution against them. Another examples of cracking down on them. Henryk Kączykowski, the veteran of the Home Army, Zośka Squad's combatment, and related to Kmita that I've mentioned, when he was released from prison, surveillance continued by security service, and there are a number of documents, and one of them indicate that a person with such past cannot live in Warsaw or near Warsaw because he's so dangerous for the system. Although he was not even an officer, but from ideological point of view, he was dangerous for the communist regime, and following a few years of imprisonment, he was in a very bad shape, and he would still be perceived as a dangerous person, and that security apparatus wanted to crush him, to expel him from Warsaw. He was living in Milanówek, near Warsaw. So they didn't want him to live next to Warsaw at all. That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Benkin. Thank you, Professor Biskupski, for moderating this part of our discussion. And there are also individuals who supported us, Małgorzata Marcinkowska and Natalia Mamur, our interpreters. We would like to thank them as well. And to wrap up, let me mention that we have a website of Janusz Kurtyka Foundation, and you can learn more about other meetings, about our awards. Tomorrow, publication of Professor Nowak will be inaugurated, launched. Routledge Publishing House published it in 2023. Dr. Benken's publication will be released on the mysterious death of Jan Anoda Rodowicz. Thank you very much for your wonderful contributions. Professor Biskupski, thank you for interesting questions, and see you soon.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.